I'm Tony Marks, and I'm the president of the New York Public Library. Welcome to the ridiculous and amazing trustees room. Please notice Thomas Jefferson over the fireplace. I've never seen it uplit before. That's fabulous. It's a little gendered, but other than that, it's a great quote. Tonight is my really special honor and pleasure to introduce the amazing and great Georgette Bennett. Georgette is an award-winning sociologist. Dr. Bennett is an award-winning sociologist, a widely published author of 11 books. That's a lot. A popular lecturer, a former broadcast journalist, an active philanthropist, and perhaps even more than active philanthropist, an activist philanthropist, focusing on conflict resolution, human rights, humanitarian diplomacy, and interreligious relations, and again, not just supporting those, but actually making them real and diving herself into them with really amazing results. In the Middle East and elsewhere. She's the founder of the Tanenbaum Center, which also carries on so much of that work. I'm proud to say, delighted to say, she is a dear friend. She is also a dear friend of the New York Public Library. She and her equally amazing former husband, who we lost last year, Leonard Polanski, made possible our Treasures exhibit downstairs, if you haven't had a chance to see it. It is extraordinary. I think it's the most visited room per square inch in the city of New York. 4 million visits so far, I think something like that. It's really extraordinary. She is also now the author of her latest remarkable book, Half Jew, Full Life, The Unlikely Journey of a Voluntary Jew from Nazi Persecution to the American Dream. The book is truly a riveting new biography that takes you from Berlin to the Bronx, from the depths of the Holocaust to a story of American success. Gary Pips Phillips, who also happened to be Georgette's cousin-in-law, which also is an amazing part of the book as she weaves in her personal relations with Pips, defied the odds at every turn, and that is putting it mildly. Georgette traces his journey through escapes, rescues, life in hiding before he emerged from the war to build a new life in America, rising from waiter to co-owner of one of the world's largest photo agencies. It is, and I can say this honestly because I devoured it, it is a truly amazing and great read about a truly amazing, great, and inspiring life, full of tragedy, full of humor, and full of love. What more could you hope for as a combination? Half Jew, Full Life is available for sale just outside this room. You can also borrow it from the New York Public Library. If you buy a copy, Georgette will be delighted to sign afterwards. You cannot sign the copies from the library. All the proceeds of sales benefit the New York Public Library, for which we're so grateful. Georgette will speak tonight with the great journalist and critic Sarah Seltzer, author most recently of the novel The Singer Sisters. You'll find both of their full bios in the programs at your seat. At the end of the conversation, Georgette would be happy to take some of your questions. You can write them down on the note cards, also on your seat with fun little pencils. And some of my colleagues will come around during the talk to collect those. Let me also note that live from NYPL, our marquee event, of which this is a part, is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends near and far. Thank you for that support, and thank you again for being here. We're going to start with the great pleasure of having Georgette read from the book, and then Sarah will join her in conversation. Thank you again for being here. Over to you, Georgette.
Tony, thank you for that great introduction. Now all I have to do is live up to it. So just to set the stage, the Nuremberg Laws have been enacted. Jews have been thrown out of most of the jobs that they held. They're no longer allowed to practice in the professions. Jewish children can no longer go to school. And so they try to make some money however they can. Phillips was a very fast cyclist, more at home on a bike than on his feet. Fittingly, his next job was making deliveries for an electrical appliance store. He mounted his bicycle in the morning, reported for duty, and was given a couple of items in a big sack, which he mounted on the rack of his bike. He rode around and made his deliveries in good time. I thought, they don't expect me back for an hour, and it's only 40 minutes. So I might as well goof off for 20 minutes and sit on a park bench, which was not exactly straight, but one of my lesser sins. Phillips went everywhere on a bike. One day, he was making his rounds and came to Fasanenstrasse, the site of a monumental synagogue by the same name. The vast sanctuary held more than 1,700 worshipers, and the epic structure made no attempt to cower in the shadows. Its main portal boldly proclaimed itself a Jewish house of worship. But in 1931, anti-Semitic gangs attacked the temple, the largest in Berlin, and the Nazis shuttered it for good in 1936. But on this day in 1938, there was a large crowd milling around Fasanenstrasse. Phillips spotted smoke and flames. He dismounted his bike and ambled into the crowd to see what was going on. As he inched closer, he saw that the synagogue was engulfed in flames. History later recorded that Joseph Goebbels himself ordered the destruction of that great tabernacle. I was terribly upset. Something like that had never happened before, even under the Nazis. And it meant the beginning of the destruction of the Jewish community. And unbeknownst to Phillips, a mile away, the synagogue where he had been made a bar mitzvah was also in ashes. Suddenly, a man broke out of the crowd and ran toward Kurfürstendamm. Dozens of people chased after him, shouting, "A Jew! A Jew! Kill the Jew!" Phillips jumped back on his bicycle and followed the crowd. There's a subway under the Kurfürstendamm with vents at street level. The crowd grabbed hold of the hapless Jew, lifted him over the grill, and flung him onto the tracks. A minute later, a train rushed by and ground him to smithereens. Phillips heard the man's screams and the shouts of the crowd. "Ha! Ha! We got him!" To say this shook me up is putting it mildly. This was the first time I saw violence with my own eyes, real violence, not just people getting kicked out of their jobs, but real violence, real murder. That left an impression on me that I will never forget. It gave me a foretaste. It's going to get worse. It was the night of November 9th, 1938. Phillips didn't yet know it, but he had just borne witness to Kristallnacht.
That was so well read, so dramatic. I want to start by thanking you, Georgette, for doing this work, because I think everyone who's in this room all know that as survivors of the Holocaust and the Shoah begin to pass on, the work of recording and preserving first-person stories is so important, particularly right now, to our collective memory and understanding. And that chilling excerpt that we just heard really speaks to just how important it is to remember what happened then and there, now and here, as we see echoes of it, right, in our own society. And also what's so compelling about that excerpt, besides the obvious just tragedy and drama, is how it speaks to the way throughout this book, your voice and Pip's voice are woven together, seamlessly. And it makes it a really compelling read. So I wanted to just sort of begin by asking you about that, because Pip's basically bequeathed his life story to you, right? So how does that happen? How does one person give their life story to someone else? And how did it happen? And how did you take that momentous inheritance?
So I have to give you some background before I directly answer the question. I was born in Budapest in 1946, and my parents, my father from Poland, my mother from Hungary, went through all of the horrors of the Holocaust, the camps, forced labor, the terrible losses. And I myself was born in a bombed-out apartment building at a time of mass starvation. Even after the Holocaust, when the Soviets liberated Hungary, my mother, who had been in German prison and concentration camp, was then put in a Soviet prison. And it was obvious that as long as we remained in Hungary, the persecution was not going to stop. Now, by then, the Iron Curtain had dropped, and you could no longer travel outside the Soviet satellite countries, but you could travel within them. So packing a suitcase, and I still have this suitcase, we went to Czechoslovakia as if we were going on vacation there, and from there we escaped to France. And we lived in France for several years until we finally got our papers to come to the US. When we arrived at the West Side piers on the Ile-de-France, which was the ship that brought us here, it was Pip's and his wife Olga who met us at the pier. We moved to Kew Gardens because that's where they were living. They were our only family here. And my father died only 8 months after we finally came here. It was his big dream to come here, and he didn't have much time to enjoy it. So Pip's became a kind of surrogate father to me. I was a rather sad child because of all of the displacement I had experienced and separations from my parents. My mother had a nervous breakdown after I was born. I'm sure she suffered from PTSD. Then when my mother got better, my father became very ill. And when he got better, I became very ill and had to be put in a sanatorium in Switzerland. So a lot going on for a very young child. But whenever Pip's was around, it brought me such happiness because he was such a character. He was the person who would pick me up by an arm and a leg and swing me around in circles. And he had this amazing talent for wiggling his ears and doing all of these extraordinary contortions with his face and whatever happened to be lying around. If it was a scarf, it was one of my mother's hats, he could turn it into some kind of absurd costume. So for me, Pip's was just an extraordinary source of fun, something that I was very much missing in my life. And Pip's came to think of me as his virtual, although not always virtuous daughter, as he would say, and he got that right. And I grew up, he grew up. He probably needed growing up more than I did. So after, let's see, age 5.5 to, how old was I when he died? I was 69. So we were in each other's lives for all that time, and I became kind of a confidant to him. He was there for the important occasions. I went to Vassar College, and there was a tradition at Vassar called Soft Father's Weekend, and he was the person who came in place of my father. He was the one who walked me down the aisle when I married my first late husband. I have 2 late husbands, and I wonder if it's something I said. And he always used to ask me for years, do you remember what you said to me right before we started walking down the aisle? And I said, yeah, I need to pee. So, Phillips started seeing a psychiatrist. Now I'm getting to answer your question. Sorry, it took a while, but I had to kind of set the mood here. He started seeing a psychiatrist on the advice of his cardiologist because he had a terrible anxiety and arrhythmia for which the cardiologist didn't find a physical basis. And so he recorded his sessions with his psychiatrist. His therapy was telling his life story. Not in chronological order, by the way. It really, the hardest part of writing this book was trying to put everything in sequence. So there were dozens of tapes of Phillips telling his life story. I had the tapes transcribed while he was still alive. And those tapes, I showed him the transcriptions so he could check them, correct them. And those tapes became the foundation for writing this book. But, you know, memory isn't always accurate. And so I had to fact-check everything. And anything that I couldn't verify, I didn't put in the book. And also had to do research to create the context. I'll make my next answers shorter.
No, that feeds in perfectly to my next question, which is, when you were going through those transcripts, and obviously there was a huge amount of fact-checking and research, as you said, but you know, you knew him for all these decades since you were a child. But was there anything that you heard in there that truly shocked you or surprised you that made it into the book?
So I don't think anything shocked me or surprised me because I knew him that well. It would have been very hard to be shocked about anything that Phillips did because he was so outrageous and so wildly inappropriate and just saw the absurdity in everything. But what I did come to appreciate, you know, I had heard these stories my entire life because Phillips loved to talk. Anybody who would listen, he wanted to tell his story to them. But what I did come to appreciate was his survival instinct and what that meant, how much staying alive meant to him. Survival was his form of resistance. But something else that I came to understand, and I don't know, Sarah, maybe this is something you want to get into later, but it really belongs as part of the answer to this question. Later in Phipps's life, he got involved in some pretty sordid stuff, which I didn't understand at the time, and in fact, I was pretty angry with him about it. He started, this is in his 70s, 80s, 90s, he started going to strip clubs. And there were lap dancers. And he sort of became their pet client. They would throw birthday parties for him. And he had 2 favorites over time, not simultaneously, but sequentially, prostitutes. And he kept wanting to bring them to dinner. And I had this young son, and I said, Phillips, you're not going to bring a hooker to dinner with my 7-year-old. I'm sorry. And I really didn't understand what that was all about. And in fact, I called his psychiatrist and I said, I'm really not comfortable with this material because I don't want people reading this and saying, oh, of course, look at the dirty Jew, of course he's going to do stuff like that. But the psychiatrist told me, I don't think Pips would want you to whitewash the story. And he said, you also have to understand what this meant. It wasn't about sex. And in fact, at that age, Pips couldn't do anything sexually anyway, let's face it. He had all kinds of medical problems that would have precluded that. And I came to see the connection between that, what he was doing later in life, and an episode that had occurred when he was in prison in Berlin. There was a mother and a daughter who arrived in the prison, and they were scheduled to be deported to Auschwitz the next morning. And the mother asked Pips to sleep with them, to have sex with both the mother and the daughter. And I think a lot of men would have taken that as a source of pride. Hey, I didn't just do the mother, I did the daughter too. Pips didn't understand it that way at all. He said, look, these women were not whores. These were ordinary women who had gone through some terrible things and now awaited a terrible fate. And all they wanted was to hold on to a little bit of life before they met that fate. That's what that encounter was about. And I came to understand, through writing this book, that's what his encounters late in life were about, that there was a direct link between that and later. It was a way to hold on to a little bit of life, just human comfort, warmth.
And you know, what I found very interesting in the chapters towards the end of his life was the grace that he was given by a lot of people around him. And I thought it was very, his questionable comments, the outrageous behavior, as you describe it, wasn't taken as outrageous by a lot of people, the people from the sort of medical staff who took care of him to people in his household, because I think that must have come through on some level, that he had a zest for life, and it connects. He was a man who really loved nature and hiking, and being outdoors, and that all seemed to be sort of part of the same, almost insatiable need to be alive.
Yes. People found him very endearing. I eventually came to find him very annoying.
Yeah, and I think that, that's the unique aspect of your perspective as someone who is really close to him, and that makes the project of being his biographer really interesting. And so, just to circle back to what you were saying before about sort of not whitewashing the story, and how that, for anyone who's writing about a persecuted minority, that's something that comes up when we tell these stories, because we don't want to, quote unquote, air the dirty laundry, but at the same time, there is power in telling the unvarnished truth. So can you talk about kind of your process of going from, first listening to the tapes and thinking about whether you wanted to put everything in there to what became the finished book, basically?
Well, my process was to stick very closely to Pip's story and to his voice, because he was telling the story the way he wanted it to be heard. And he even wrote at one point, because he would write notes to me from time to time, saying that, I have a story, and I think it's a story that people would be interested to hear, especially the part which is now part one of the book, called Nowhere to Run, Nowhere to Hide, which is the story of his life in Berlin during the Holocaust. And I came to understand that this was a Holocaust story. I mean, we have so many stories of survivors, but there were 4 ways in which this story is quite different from most of them. Number 1, he was a voluntary Jew. Phipps was born to an Aryan mother and a Jewish father. And as a Mischling first degree, that was a Nazi classification, which translates into mongrel, by the way, he would not have been subjected to deportation. But the very week that the Nuremberg Laws were enacted, he decided to become a bar mitzvah. He decided to become a bar mitzvah for 2 reasons. His friends were all Jewish, and he wanted to fit in. We'll get back to the theme of fitting in. The other reason was he wanted a new bicycle. Now, that bicycle was stolen 3 weeks later, but the label Jew, that stuck. So that's number 1. He was a voluntary Jew. Number 2, unlike most Berlin Jews who were deported, he went into hiding. There were 130,000 Jews in Berlin. 6,000 of them went into hiding, went underground. He was one of those. And by doing that, he gave up the protection that he had of living with an Aryan parent. And he gave it up because he fell in love with a young woman who was a full Jew. And the deportations had started. And in 1943, when her family received the summons to appear at Gestapo headquarters, he convinced her not to go with her family, but to go underground with him. And that was a terribly difficult thing to do for reasons that maybe we can talk about a little bit later. So they survived 3.5 months living underground, and then they were caught in the Alexanderplatz train station. She was deported to Auschwitz, and he was arrested, of course. That was the first of 4 arrests, and 3 escapes. So that's the third thing about his story that's unusual. And the fourth thing is that he wasn't just persecuted by the Nazis, but on several occasions, Nazis saved his life. And these are really interesting parts of the book. So when you ask about process, as I came to understand these unique aspects of his experience, I kind of structured the book around that.
And it's so riveting. I was actually just rereading the scene in the Alexanderplatz station right before we began, and I mean it's cinematic, really. The being chased through the subway station, and as those, I took the subway to get here. Just thinking about it, it's so chilling. What do you think gave him? Do you think it was just something innate in his personality that gave him the courage to escape that many times, and also to make himself useful enough in various situations, right, where he was able to get help from the Nazis? Is it that same just drive for life and for belonging that we were talking about?
Yeah, I think it's totally that drive for life, and also the fact that he saw the absurdity in everything. So he couldn't take everything seriously, and that was a huge help for him in terms of his survival. I don't think he saw himself as courageous at all. And he certainly didn't see himself as a hero. And I don't see him as a hero, but he doesn't need to be a hero.
Yeah. And do you think that he understood being in Berlin, that he was sort of in the belly of the beast, or was it just home to him? I think one of the things that we haven't touched on yet that is so compelling about his identity is how German he, both Phipps and also the Jewish community that he was surrounded by, like even after they were forbidden from doing these sort of patriotic German summer camps, the Jewish groups were doing their own patriotic German summer camp till the very bitter end.
Until they were shut down.
Until they were shut down. And I think yeah, I mean, I think his conflict about his identity comes through so powerfully, about being both German and Jewish.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it was a conflict. He was passionately German in terms of German culture. He loved Goethe and Wagner and the martial music.
Songs.
Yeah, he loved all of that, but he hated what Germany had become. And in terms of his identity, it was a gradual accretion of identity before he started feeling that he was Jewish. In fact, he would quip, Hitler made me a Jew. It didn't start out that way, but he had a number of experiences which didn't impact him directly. You know, of course they saw the brown shirts marching and singing the Horst Wessel song and the daggers hanging from their belt, but they didn't feel that that had anything to do with them in particular. He, when he was still going to the Aryan school, religion was a course that was taught. Of course, it was Christianity, and his mother encouraged him to go. But the first time he went, the teacher was telling the students about how Jews killed their Christ. So he never went back. That was kind of a formative experience for him. There was a classmate of his who was tied to a tree and beaten, but he said, you know, I wasn't a Jew, so that really didn't affect me. But gradually, these things started to build up, and he was passionate about being a Jew. In fact, he said, I don't want to be a half Jew. I want to be a full Jew. And his entire life, what he wanted most was to be accepted as a full Jew. He was passionate about Israel, but Israel would not have recognized him as a Jew. Orthodox Jews would not have recognized him as a Jew.
Yeah. Do you feel that sort of by the end of his life, he felt fully Jewish, or do you think that that was sort of a primal wound that never healed from your perspective?
He was pained by not being accepted, or when he felt he wasn't accepted. And there are a number of episodes in the book that illustrate that. And he was bitter about it, because he was very clear about his identity. But the flip side of that was when he felt he was accepted. For example, he had been invited to sing in a chorus in a synagogue, and Pips had this magnificent, deep bass voice. And he kept singing an octave below what he was supposed to be singing. And the conductor of the choir got very frustrated because, you know, the choir wasn't harmonizing. And in his frustration, he said, Yidden, Yidden. Pips felt great about that because he was being included as a Yid.
I love that. Just to pivot a little bit, his life, at least the sort of first, most of his life, is defined by two great loves, which you delineate very clearly. And the first, we've talked about Ilse, who is sort of the spur and the reason that he stays in Berlin and goes underground. And then there's also Olga. So do you want to just tell us a little bit about these two? Because I think, you know, an important thing about this book is that it doesn't just tell Pips's story, right? There's multiple stories of the Shoah in the book, and Olga's story is another survivor story that's very different from, you know, intertwined with deeply, but different from Pip's.
Yes, so Olga was the person who was actually my blood relative, right, albeit a distant one. Pips was not. Olga was Hungarian, and the Nazis did not go into Hungary until 1944. And by then, they were already losing the war. But they prioritized killing Jews over winning the war.
So within a couple of months, 440,000 Budapest Jews were deported to Auschwitz, most of them killed. Olga and her mother were among the first group of deportees. Her father had already died in Ukraine, doing forced labor. When they arrived in Auschwitz, of course, the men were separated from the women and children. And if you were a woman with a child under 15 years old, well, immediately you were sent to the gas chamber. While Olga and her mother were in line, there was a child who was crying because she couldn't find her mother. And Olga's mother, wanting to comfort that child, took her hand, and immediately she was sent this way to the gas chambers, just flick of a wrist. Olga couldn't find her mother, so she asked one of the Polish trustees. Of course, the Poles had been there in Auschwitz for years and were already hardened and numb. And then she asked the trustee, I can't find my mother, where's my mother? And the trustee said, did your mother have a child with her? And Olga said, yes, but it wasn't her child. And he said, it doesn't matter. You see that smoke over there coming out of that chimney? That's where your mother is. So that was Olga's arrival in Auschwitz. She survived Auschwitz, and she also survived the death march from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, and ended up in the prison that Phillips was in Berlin. So that's where they met, and that's where their stories begin to converge. But they handled their response to the Holocaust in very, very different ways.
Yeah. Do you want to say more, or do you think that people should read about it in the book?
Yes, so Phillips, as I mentioned before, loved to talk.
Yeah.
He would tell everybody who would listen his story. And as I said, he saw the absurdity in everything. He had an extraordinary sense of humor. And I think that's what allowed him to process his trauma. Olga was the opposite. She did not want to talk about it. She even refused, and of course Phillips had to refuse with her, to be interviewed for the survivors of the Shoah project that Steven Spielberg started. And she never had a job, except in Auschwitz. They didn't have children. She didn't volunteer. So her life was Phillips, and her friends. She, she cared very deeply about people and always tried to connect with them on an emotional level. But the older she became, the more her memories kept overwhelming her of Auschwitz. And finally, she committed suicide. And I've always thought of her as yet another victim of the Holocaust.
Absolutely. And in many ways, reading her story, it feels more, like the prototypical story that you hear when you talk to people who grew up in a household of survivors, where it was never discussed. It was zipped up and and shut down. And Phipps's sort of loquaciousness is very different. And you're right that it does feel like he was able to process it that way. But there is this period where they're kind of living the American dream, as you describe it, and having glamour years, I think, and together, and they have a number of surrogate children figures who come in and out of their lives. So I think, and they're part of sort of the New York, and it's a very New York, it feels very New York, that section, right, where there are these characters who are mingling. So there are these moments, I think, of, I don't know if I would say happiness, but of an interesting and positive life for the two of them together.
Yeah, well, as I think Tony said, he started as a waiter, started as a bicycle messenger, and ended up co-owning the largest photo agency in the world. And the nature of the photo business back then, it was really kind of the start of photojournalism in a way, was selling picture stories to magazines and newspapers. A lot of these involved celebrities. So Pips ended up hobnobbing with a lot of the celebrities of the day. And part 2 of the book is full of bold-faced names and, you know, snarky comments about how he really felt about these celebrities, about, you know, Bob Wagner and Raquel Welch and so on. Tells stories about Judy Holliday. Looking at some of the demographic in this room, you probably remember Judy Holliday, right? Yeah. So I'll tell one anecdote.
Yes.
Is that okay? Judy Holliday. My mother was a custom-made lingerie designer. That was the trade that she learned in Hungary, and that's how we survived here. So Pips wanted to help her out. One day, he was going to Judy Holliday's apartment because they were doing an all-day photo shoot with her in different venues in New York, I think the Metropolitan Museum and so on. And Judy Holliday, this was in the summer, she comes out wearing a mink coat. And Pips wonders, you know, aren't you too warm in that? She said, well, I'm wearing it because I'm going to plots out of my dress, quote. And that son of a bitch at, what is it, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, I forgot which studio she was with, said, if I don't lose 20 pounds, then I can just go to hell. So Pip says, well, I happen to have a relative who does custom-made undergarments that can make you look 20 pounds thinner. It was true, my mother could do that. And so Judy Holliday kind of eyes him suspiciously. She says, what does she charge for those things? And Pip said, $75. This was in the 1950s. And she says, are you out of your mind? She was known to be a cheapskate. And Pips recognized a cheapskate when he saw one, because he was one himself.
So the sale never got made to
Not
to Judy Holliday, but to
Judy
plenty
Holliday,
of other people.
But to Happy Rockefeller it did.
I think that there's, so, you know, throughout, particularly in the second, but no, throughout his whole life, really, you know, Pips has these intense relationships with women. And it's, you know, the story is the biography of Pips, but there are so many caretakers and strong female figures in his life. So how, you know, and we talked a little bit about sort of his, about masculinity and his particular version of masculinity, which includes, I think, you know, a lot of lightness and humor and openness, as well as some more stereotypical male characteristics.
Well,
the dirty old man.
Well,
comment.
he was a serial kisser.
Yes. Busser, as you say in the book. So yeah, I mean, the gender politics in the book are really interesting, and you know, I think, yeah, I mean, maybe talk about, you know, as a woman writing the story, kind of how you saw his relationship with women and the role that women had in his life and his survival.
Well, I want to start with the relationships that are the easiest to misunderstand, which were the ones with the strippers and his two favorite prostitutes. They were not meat to him. They were not meat. These were relationships. One of them, he wanted to introduce her to New York culture, to take her to Wave Hill and to take her to the Botanical Garden and all the places that he loved. And another one was somebody who just felt like a very good friend to him. In fact, right before he died, I think Hector, who's in the room, went to visit him, and Pips confided to him, you know, I think I'm ready to die. I'm ready to go. And that was huge for Pips, who wanted only to live, no matter what. And then his favorite prostitute came to visit him. And when Hector came back later, Pips said, I've changed my mind. So women were not meat. And he was a combination of complete insensitivity and unfiltered, and on the other hand, could be deeply sensitive, as he was to this mother and daughter in his prison who were being deported to Auschwitz. So I think he didn't, I mean, in a sense, he was in a very traditional marriage. Olga didn't work. She took care of the home. She took care of him. They had decided early on not to have children. But I don't think he disrespected women. He felt enormous affection toward women, and it was genuine. He was a very affectionate guy. And when I said he was a serial kisser, that was true. It's not that he went around kissing women on the mouth. He did not. But he just would kiss them on the cheek because he just felt great affection for them.
We have some really excellent questions from the audience, so we'll see how many we can get through in the next few minutes. These are fantastic. So the first is, to what extent did Pips feel like an American? Did he see himself as assimilated here, or did he always view himself as other, German to some degree?
Yes, that's a very insightful question. He spoke perfect, unaccented English and fit here very, very well. He really fit in. But he was also aware, how can you be German, Jewish, American at the same time, and what are you really with all of these identities? So that's something that he struggled with, and in a way, this book really is a book about identity. What is identity? What is the price we pay for maintaining an identity?
And a related question is, what were his political views? Did he have, I'm just amending this, did he have strong political views? Did he get involved? And did his political views change over time?
I can tell you his political views about Israel. Very right-wing. We had some battles about that. Yeah. His political views in the US, I'm not sure we discussed much of that. The chairman of the Democratic National Committee lived in his building when they moved to 860 UN Plaza. And I'm not sure whether that had an effect on his politics at all. I know that he had a Rolls Royce in the garage. I forgot his name. And Pips used to like going down to the garage to get into the chairman's Rolls Royce because he liked the way the doors closed, so he would get in and out of the Rolls Royce. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you, but I honestly don't remember the political conversations that we had.
It's really interesting, actually. Another great question, and I think I know the answer, but did Pips's sense of the absurd and sort of delight in the absurd rub off on you? I mean, you certainly seem to, in the book, have a great appreciation for it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have a highly developed sense of the absurd. I take things a little bit more seriously.
Why do you think Pips's mother didn't stop him from fully embracing his identity as a Jew? Or did she try to?
Oh, she tried very hard to stop him. When Pips became a bar mitzvah, after that, she tried very hard to get him Aryanized. And she went so far as to file an affidavit saying that Pips's father was not actually his father, that his real father was one of her cousins, therefore an Aryan, meaning that Pips was fully Aryan. So she tried very hard to protect him in that way. And that became a real issue between Ilse, the love of his life, Ilse Rosenthal, the young woman he went into hiding with, because she kept pressing him. You have to decide, is it going to be me or is it going to be Aryanization? And they had a lot of discussions about that because she realized he had to make a choice. It could not be both of them or both of those things.
It's amazing how love really altered fate there.
Yes.
Yeah. We have just a comment from someone talking about his former father-in-law who was from Budapest and escaped, but his family was all sent to a camp, and that his story is also a sadness to success story, and he had a difficult time telling his story but never forgot. I'm sure that's not the only person in the audience who has a family member, and there's something amazing about how telling one story, even in its uniqueness and difference, brings out other people's stories and stories of their family members as well. I have one more that I thought would be sort of a fitting, let's see. Are there any moments, or was there any point reading the transcripts or going over the darkest parts of this story that made you falter or made you feel like you couldn't write the book? And if so, I'm going to add my own coda to that question. How did you motivate yourself to keep going through those dark parts? Because you obviously did finish the book beautifully.
Pips wanted his story to be told. And it was not the dark parts where I faltered. It was the sordid parts where I faltered. You know, the business with the strip clubs. Not the dark parts. I think it's very, very important, especially at a time of Holocaust denial, to tell these stories. And there's a tremendous appetite for these stories. And I think Dara Horn understands why there's a tremendous appetite for these stories, because people love dead Jews. But this was one dead Jew who has a very life-affirming story to tell. And I wanted to tell the story. I owed him telling this story. It took me 10 years to get around to telling his story. But once I got to it, it took me only 6 months to write this book.
Wow, that's amazing. But it was.
I heard somebody make a comment. You're absolutely right. The story told itself. That is so true. Yeah. That is so true.
And it was marinating for your whole life, really. Yeah, in a sense. We were just talking. So to go back to Dara Horn and People Love Dead Jews, about the appetite for Holocaust stories and how that's manifesting now in sort of some of these more commercial endeavors, whether it's the remake of the Nuremberg film or I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but it seems like Auschwitz is a popular location for commercial fiction, the tattooists of Auschwitz, the sisters of Auschwitz, and the orchestra, right? And I don't know, I haven't read all the books or seen all the films, but it feels like as the stories of real survivors are fading, there are these sort of fictionalizations that are coming to the fore. And I think, how do you feel about that? And what do you think makes a good, or in your view, how do we evaluate some of that, what's coming out about the Shoah?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. My first late husband, who was Rabbi Mark Tanenbaum, perhaps some of you knew him. He and Elie Wiesel had a real falling out over this issue. Mark was one of the major consultants for the Holocaust series called Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel was very offended by the series, by the fictionalizing of Holocaust experiences. Mark was very much in favor of the series because of the enormous impact it had on raising consciousness about the Holocaust, especially in Germany, where it was an extraordinarily popular series. And of course, Germany is the only country in Europe that has confronted its past. And that series had a lot to do with it, had a lot to do with a change among Germans, especially young Germans. So I agree with Mark. I have no problem with fictionalizing, telling fictional, let me not say fictionalizing, telling fictional stories about the Holocaust, as long as they are true to the Holocaust, as long as they are not just exploitation, cheap exploitation. I have to, and also, as some of these events get reinterpreted, for example, the film Nuremberg that has just come out, I was very eager to see that because it had been so well reviewed. And when I saw it, I was actually appalled because it seemed to be such a perversion of what the Nuremberg trials had been about. So I think it takes some discretion to do it right. But in principle, fiction really moves people. Yeah. And it sometimes moves people much more than reality.
Well, as a novelist, I'm delighted to hear you say that. We have one final question from the audience, which is, and I'm going to again broaden it because they asked about writers that you admire. But what art or writing or nonfiction has inspired you recently, either while you were working on this book or since the book, you know, in the last few months as you've been talking about the book? What's been moving you? And it does not have to be highbrow.
Boy, I haven't given this any thought at all. What has inspired me? The problem is at my age, I don't retain anything I read, so I can't remember what inspires me. I can tell you what I read to relax. I read books about serial killers. Serial killers, not serial kissers.
Are you reading the Icelandic, the Norse ones? I feel like that's what my parents are really into
tell
right
me
now.
about
They're
it.
super into
I love Scandinavian and Icelandic
serial killers. I feel like I go home, their whole shelves are Scandinavian serial killers.
I need to give a more serious answer to that question. It has nothing to do with the Holocaust. Maybe it has everything to do with the Holocaust, come to think of it. But I'm reading a book, and of course I'm blocking on her name because at my age you lose all the proper nouns. She's a very famous religion writer, and it's a book about Jesus and how the biblical Jesus came to be perceived in the way that he was Yes, thank you. Thank you. So that's a book that I'm reading now, which I'm finding very, very interesting.
So it's a cultural history of the perception of Jesus? Yeah.
Not so much a cultural history, but interpreting the Gospels and interpreting what actually was going on historically at that time.
Well, no better way to end this talk than by talking about the Gospels. I cannot Well, we have to mix humor with tragedy, right? That's what we do.
That's what
we
Pips
do,
did.
and that's what Pips did. I can't thank you enough for this book and for your time, and I know everyone here feels the same way. So thank you, and make sure you buy the book, everybody.
And for you, Sarah, thank you for being such a great interlocutor.
We could have
And
talked
thank
all
you
night.
for being such a great audience.